So I want to end this lecture by talking just very briefly about the article that you read for this week and just telling you a little bit more about it, why I chose it for you to read. And so this is the Leroy et al. Article, 2017, and I picked this because it's a really excellent example of what psychoneuroimmunology research looks like. It's got a pretty typical paradigm in it, right? They take a bunch of people, they quarantine them all, and they expose them to a cold virus, and they see what happens. They see how many people get infected and how they feel. And this is a pretty typical paradigm in psychoneuroimmunology work, where we want to see how people respond to illness and how their immune system works. We need to give it something to respond to. So often students are very concerned about the ethics of this, and I think that's a really interesting question to think about. Right? So certainly people are paid to be in these studies and they do consent, but it is interesting to think about how much should people be paid for that? What's enough to risk infection of a cold? But I also say that part of why we're able to do these and why these are important work is this has important implications for how we treat disease, but also it's not by coincidence that we do this with cold viruses and not with more potentially dangerous things. People very rarely or never die of a cold virus if they're healthy people, and so we screen out people who are not healthy. We take healthy individuals and we expose them to this relatively benign thing that could make them sick. And so what they did in this study is they took 213 participants, again in good health. They exposed them all to this cold virus and they quarantine everybody for 5 days in a hotel, and they isolate them. And then what they did in this study is they studied the 75.1% that became infected. So most of these people came down with the cold virus, and these are the people that they were interested in. My guess in this study is that they might have originally hypothesized that there might be some difference in who got sick, but it doesn't look like that happened, and so it looks like most people came down with that cold, and then they were interested in what determined differences in how severe those cold systems were perceived to be. And so they looked at two key predictors: perceived loneliness versus social isolation. Right, and these seem like very similar variables, but they're important in a key way. Social isolation, the way that this is operationalized, is really about your social network size, right? It's how many people are in your social network. So someone with many acquaintances would have less social isolation than someone with very few acquaintances and friends. But perceived loneliness is different, right? That's the subjective feeling here. And so you could think of someone who has very few friends but is very satisfied with that, right? They're very good friends and they don't feel lonely. Or you could think of someone who has also the same number of friends, the same social network size, but feels very lonely with that. And so this is really getting at that subjective experience of social isolation versus the more objective one in terms of social network size. And so again, they looked at cold incidence, this is how many people got it, and again, there was no differences in who came down with the cold, but then they looked at self-reported symptoms. They also weighed people's mucus, but there was no difference in that either. I would hate to be the research assistant for that part of the study. And so what they found a few things, but lonely participants were no more likely to get the virus than less lonely participants. Other studies have found that lonelier people are more likely to get sick, but again, this is not necessarily going to be true in every study, and it's not 100%. And so it could be that in this one, because everybody was exposed, there was just such a high ceiling for people to get sick that you're not able to see that difference. But regardless, loneliness predicted greater self-reported cold symptoms and severity among those infected. So people who felt lonelier and reported feeling lonelier also felt sicker. But social network size didn't predict that. So having more people in your social network was not related to how sick you felt. And these results, importantly, hold even after you control for depressive affect. So it's not just that people who are downers feel more sick and feel more lonely. That's not accounting for it. So it does seem to be that there's something about loneliness that made people experience their cold as worse. But if you look at the weight of mucus, it doesn't seem like they were producing any more mucus, but again, that could be confounded by other things. But this is an interesting study for a number of reasons. Again, first, that it's a good example of the type of paradigms that are used in psychoneuroimmunology work, but with some variables that are easier for us to understand coming from outside that work. There's a lot fewer technical terms in this one than some other psychoneuroimmunology work that involves a lot of physiological systems. And then secondly, it's interesting to see that it really is this subjective experience of loneliness, and that's a stressful thing to feel alone and to feel isolated, and this led people to experience their cold as worse. So this is what we're showing here in this graph. At baseline, everyone reported equally low cold symptoms, and then those went up over time as people got sick, but they went up the highest in people who were high on loneliness compared to people who were low on loneliness and people in the middle. So again, loneliness was related to greater self-reported cold symptoms. So that's really the takeaway message you want to get from this. So I know you all talk about this in your groups, either synchronously or asynchronously, but I just wanted to give that information as well. So that's it for today, and thank you very much, and I will see you next time.